start on good. I think today, good timing. We shouldn't have to rush, and we could understand the Rambam pretty well, God willing, together. So we're holding.
I do have a meeting that I'm going to have to go to, so I am going to have to leave early.
Okay, no problem. Whenever you're here for, we're happy to have you with us, Ira. Okay, great. So basically, today's Rambam, we're holding the 7th chapter of 11 chapters in the laws of mikvah, and the Hilchas Mikvah, and the laws of mikvah that we have. We're learning all about what makes a mikvah kosher, what disqualifies, and all kinds of stuff. So we in yesterday's class and the 2 days before, we spoke about how to disqualify a mikvah, and what is one of the key factors of disqualifying a mikvah before it gets to the 40 sa, the magical number that the mikvah is kosher. One of the key factors we said is if the water was handled too much human intervention, that's going to disqualify the mikvah. If you have about 35 ounces, 3 lugim of handled drawn water, that's going to disqualify it. And the whole class yesterday about the vessels. Today we're going to do the opposite. We're going to say that almost nothing could disqualify a mikvah that has 40 sa. Once the mikvah has the appropriate 40 sa, whatever that is, 80, 90 gallons or 170 gallons, whatever the different opinions of how much is 40 sa. Once the mikvah has the correct, appropriate amount for a kosher mikvah of having the 40 sa in the mikvah, once it has that, the mikvah is kosher, and it's very hard to make that non-kosher. So if drawn water fell into a mikvah that is a kosher mikvah, we don't care. You can add and add and add. Take a hose and add as much water as you want to the original 40 sa. As long as we have that originally 40 sa in there, all the drawn water added will not disqualify it. So comes the question, well, what is there anything that could disqualify it? And there's one thing that could disqualify it, and that thing is if the color of the mikvah changes, that can disqualify the mikvah. So in other words, even though you have the 40 sa, the original 40 sa, very hard to disqualify it, especially through all the things we've spoken about in the last few days. But if you're going to mess up the color, then it's possible for the mikvah to become disqualified. It's a joke, because some of the dirty mikvahs that maybe you've been to, they always make jokes. Oh, I don't know if this is a kosher mikvah anymore. So it's actually, today's topic is going to be on what exactly, it's not so simple, what disqualifies a mikvah or not. So we're actually going to see what doesn't matter what changed the color, right? That's going to be an interesting question we're going to have. Does it matter? Was it fruit juice? Was it ink? What if someone had a dye? They put a dye in there to change the color, So was the substance originally a water that was changed the color of the original water, like a kind of a dye made out of water that you threw it in? Or what happens if, it's just the water itself changed color? What disqualifies a mikvah? And that is going to be 11 halachas on chapter 7, is discussing how to disqualify a mikvah that has the 40 sa already. Here we go. A mikvah will not change if the taste of the mikvah changes. So if you were to drink some of the water and it really changed its taste, no problem. Or the smell, I guess if it smells bad or different kinds of smells are coming out of the mikvah, that does not affect the mikvah. Ella, the only thing that can change a mikvah that was a kosher mikvah and disqualify it if the appearance of the mikvah changed, the coloring, the appearance. When you look at the water and you see different color, different changes in the color, that's possible to change a mikvah. And he's going to say a broad statement, and the Rambam is going to qualify his statement, what that means. Here's the broad statement. Anything that a mikvah cannot be made out of to begin with, you can't use something to make the mikvah out of. It's not kosher water for a mikvah. Anything that's not kosher to make a mikvah out of. Those items that can originally be used to create the original 40 sa necessary to create a mikvah, if those substances that can mess up the original 40 will be added, and they will add a color now. So wrong waters that can't be used. Imagine maybe if it was waters that could be used for a mikvah, that had a distinct color, would change the color. It's not a problem, because those liquids you added could anyway be used as a mikvah. But if you added liquid that is not good for a mikvah, that has a color and that changed the color of the mikvah, then that can disqualify the mikvah by changing the color, even though you already had the 40 sa necessary. You had a kosher mikvah, but they were added and they changed the color. Now it's not the original mikvah, it's the color of the prohibited substance, and now it's not a kosher mikvah. Ketzad, what's an example? So the Rambam is going to explain how it works. Hayayin, imagine somebody had wine, or yachalav, or somebody had milk, the hadam or blood. These are different things that change color. Wine changes color, milk and blood. Or any kind of fruit juice, right? Here's an interesting rule. Those items we just mentioned that have strong colors in them, they will actually not disqualify the mikvah. Those are not problematic with drawn water, even though, hey, and we said drawn water is an issue. Here's a very important rule. Only drawn water is an issue, and therefore those drawn waters will disqualify the mikvah if it's the original 40. But even though it's handled in wine, milk, and blood, or fruit juice is obviously handled by human intervention, but when the rabbis prohibited handled liquid, they only prohibited handled water liquid. That once it handles, that will disqualify your original mikvah. But they never prohibited if somebody handled other kinds of liquids like wine, milk, and blood. That the rabbi's original prohibition of not allowing a mikvah to be made out of a handled items. Whoops, I just went move my place here. Sorry, is only on liquid, only on water that was handled, and not in other liquids that are handled. This rule is important to understand the rest of this chapter. Okay. And anything that you do not make a mikvah with to begin with, right? Any items that you can't use. Where I'm holding it, sorry. Give the example. However, although they won't disqualify by being handled, because handled liquid is only an issue with water, but there is a way that wine and milk could disqualify a mikvah by changing its color. So, and by they're not originally an issue to use them to disqualify the original 40 because they were handled, because we only care about handled by water. However, for changing an appearance, these items could affect and ruin the mikvah, even if it had me'asa, even if it had 100 sa, it had a huge amount of gallons of water, it was a whole pool, like a mikvah that was as big as a big pool. And then into that pool he fell one leg, only like, a limited amount, I don't know, 10 ounces of wine, like made Paris or juice, Bashinas, Marav, Puzzle, and it had a very strong effect on the water, this huge amount of water, and changed the color. Then now it looks like a clear color of wine or milk or fruit juice or blood. This water looks like blood. They will disqualify the mikvah. So these liquids that we mentioned will not be able to disqualify the mikvah because of handled water in the original 40. But once it has the 40, even if it has the 40, if they will affect the mikvah through the coloring, that will disqualify and ruin your mikvah. So too, if the mikvah had 20 saw, half of the necessary amount for a kosher mikvah, or less, and into that 20, one saw of wine and made Paris or fruit juice, and they didn't change the color of the mikvah, they're kosher. So the whole problem with these liquids is only the discoloring. If they were a light color, the milk, the wine, that it didn't change the mikvah color. Even if they fell in before the mikvah was a proper mikvah, they will not ruin the mikvah, even though they're handled, because handles is only on water. The wine is not water, and neither is milk, or neither is blood water. And therefore, as long as they don't change the color, even though they were handled, they will not disqualify the mikveh, even if they were entered into the mikveh before the mikveh was the 40 sa necessary to make it a kosher mikveh. However, one thing's for sure, they won't count as the necessary amount just because they won't ruin the mikveh, even though they were drawn, but they will not count. You will still need a full 40 of kosher water to use as a mikveh. They won't ruin it, but they also won't count to add to the mikveh, to the 40 sa necessary for the mikveh. And therefore, if you put in the original 20, then some wine fell in, didn't discolor it, but then you added another 20, of kosher, you added another 20 of kosher mikveh waters, now you have a kosher mikveh, and you don't have to worry about the fact that in between, while you were adding the 40, fell in a thing of wine, because the wine didn't discolor your mikvah, and therefore you're kosher. Again, so they're two totally separate topics. There is handled water, which will disqualify your original 40, because you're not allowed to put handled water into the making of your mikvah. But once your mikvah is made, you could add however much handled water you want, and it won't disqualify the original 40. These liquids with colors like wine, their whole issue is only on the discoloring. If they discolor, mikvah is no good. If they don't discolor the mikvah is good. They don't help you add to the 40 needed to make a mikvah, but they also don't take away unless they discolor. Okay, so now we go on to mikvah. The Rambam says, I'm going to give you 3 categories, because there's also different liquids. There's every liquid, what liquids count as ones that will disqualify the mikvah. So now we have to know that there's different kinds of liquids, because you're telling me that there's different statuses of different liquids. So Rambam says there's 3 categories. Yes, that's a mikvah. Some mikvah, some liquids will actually help you add to the 40 necessary to make the mikvah, and they will also not disqualify your mikvah, so they're only good. Then there's another kind of liquid which the Rambam is going to discuss, which is paislin v'lei mailin. They will go to the opposite extreme. They will disqualify your mikvah and not help your mikvah at all. And then there's a third kind of liquids that's lei mailin v'lei paislin. They won't help your mikvah, and they also won't disqualify your mikvah. So there are liquids that will help and not disqualify your mikvah. There are liquids that will not help and disqualify your mikvah, and there were liquids that won't disqualify but won't help. The kind of a middle stance. And the Rambam is going to go through the different kinds of liquids, explain them in the next 3 halachas, 3, 4, and 5, about which liquids help, which don't, and which don't do anything at all. These liquids, here's the category of liquids that mylin, that they help make your mikvah a good mikvah, the 40 saw. And they don't disqualify them. He's going to give a very interesting example. Hasheleg, snow. By the way, in some areas where it doesn't rain, I think one of the tricks they made is they found a way and take a truck that has a hole in it, and they take tons of snow and they put the snow in the mikvah, and then the snow melts. Or some opinion even says you can go to the mikvah in the snow. So snow is not water, but snow is what we're saying is considered, even snow is considered to be a good water, and it can actually does not disqualify your mikvah. You could use it to add the 40 saw to your mikvah. It's like snow. Barad is hail. Va'akvoir, or sleet, or hail or sleet. Va'haglid, and ice. Even melach, even salt. Petit haneroik, which is a mud, but a very liquidy mud, a flowing mud. All those items, they help. They could be considered part of the original 40 of your mikvah, and they don't disqualify your mikvah. Snow, ice, interesting, even salt. All these things are part of water, the regular water, and they just add to your mikvah. As long as they weren't human intervention, I guess, weren't handled by humans, they can actually add. So it snows in your mikvah. Now that snow falls in your mikvah, that snow could be part of the original 40. Ketzad, how is it? Give me an example. If you had a mikvah that had 40 saw, missing 1 saw to make it a kosher mikvah, and any one of those above substances, the snow and the ice, fell in to your mikvah, giving it another saw, that fills it up to the right amount of 40 saw, but a mikvah kosher v'shalom, and the mikvah is kosher. So all those kinds of, even a very liquid, a watery mud, a mud that's very liquidy, all of those things can add to the 40 saw of the mikvah. So it comes out, those substances, they only help your mikvah and they don't disqualify your mikvah. Even if somebody brought 40 saw of snow, in the beginning, that's how he made his whole mikvah from beginning to end. He got a ton of snow. He's living in the North Pole. He's living in Alaska, and they want to make a mikvah, and maybe they have a heater under the mikvah floor, and the snow falls in there, and they use snow to make a mikvah. The entire mikvah could be made of the snow. And they put them there in a cavity and crushed it. So they crushed, or maybe one of the opinions that Rambam says they didn't even have to melt the snow. They just made it soft enough, I guess, that a person could go in the snow. He says you could even toivel, according to some opinions, the woman could go in the snow, though I'm sure it's very cold, could go in the snow and use the snow as a mikvah. Harei ze mikvah shalom kasha. The bottom line is, snow is 100% a kosher mikvah, and therefore category 1, the best kind of category of these liquids, is that if there's snow or so on, they actually not disqualify the mikvah, they can be used like regular water, like regular rainwater, and make the mikvah kosher. Halacha 4, Daled. Ve'elu poislin v'loy mylin. This is on the opposite extreme. they disqualify and they don't help you build your mikvah. What are items like that? Mayim shuvim. We learned already, drawn water, no good. They don't help you make your mikvah. That's very bad to have drawn water in there. Whether they're pure or impure water, like we learned from the other day. Drawn water, handled water is not good for a mikvah. Then it gives you other examples of things that will ruin your mikvah, that they'll also destroy your mikvah. They won't make it a kosher mikvah. Umei kivasim, pickled water, that the water used for pickling, or mei shalakais, water used for cooking. You cook stuff inside this water. V'hatemed achle hechmitz, and a mixture of water used for grape dregs. I guess something with the grape dregs. You use the kind of water before it became vinegar. You'll see vinegar is going to be less of a problem. Once it fermented and became vinegar, it'll be less of a problem. But it's just now liquid that was soaked with like grape stuff. V'hasheichar, and also beer. All those items will ruin your mikvah. You don't want them in your mikvah to make up the original 40 ketzah. For example, mikvah sheish b'arbayim sa chaser echad. If there was a mikvah that had 40 sa minus 1 sa, mishkal dinar, and was missing only 1 drop, 2 ounces, 3 ounces of liquid, just to fill it up to the 40. One of these substances that we mentioned in the halacha dalet fell in there, right? Beer or so on. Mishkal dinar, the amount of the dinar techn ena oilam in the mikveh does not help you get the total amount of 40 sa. The lay yishtima does not fill it in there. So, being that only a little bit fell in, it didn't disqualify your mikveh, because you still need the 35 ounces enough to disqualify the. But if a full 3 lugim fell in there before you had your 40 sa, poisliness and mikveh, they will disqualify your mikveh. Now, if I understand, I'll share with you something interesting. If I understand the Rambam correctly, what's unique about these liquids is that they're also close to water. In other words, wine, what's the difference between wine and these things that they'll disqualify your mikveh? Why won't wine disqualify your mikveh? Because wine is not considered water. Wine is already like you put in a totally unnatural substance to water. It became a new identity. So it's not combining to ruin the mikveh. It stays its own identity. Milk, like he wants to say, or blood, they're not combining with the water. So actually, as long as you don't see the coloring of blood, it won't disqualify, and it didn't change your whole mikveh, it won't disqualify your mikveh, because blood and water, they're so different than each other. But if you'll notice in halacha daled, the examples that we gave, water used for pickling or for cooking, they're still water, and they were handled, and they were used and affected in such a way, beer even, he considers it still close enough to water, that they will actually disqualify your mikvah. And that is the examples in halacha dal. Halacha hey, going on to halacha 5, the items of things that do not ruin it but don't help it. Ve'elu loy poisim v'loy mailin, these items don't ruin your 40, v'loy mailin, but they don't help them get to the 40 either. Shar hamashkin, all other kinds of liquids, umei hapeiros, or fruit juice, v'hatshir, brine in a fish, v'hamuryos, or fish oil, v'atemed mishehechmitz, and the grapes that became vinegar, so it actually became vinegar, so it kind of became water that was with grape dregs that became vinegar. It already took on a new substance. Those don't help make the 40 because they're not watery enough, but they're also so far away from water that they won't ruin the water. Kate said, how is this? Mikvah sheish b'arbayim sa chaser echad. For example, there was a mikvah with 40 sa minus 1. One of these substances that are not watery like at all, they're so far away from water, fell into them sa, 1 sa, the techen lehelu. They now not help you get to the 40 because they're not considered water. But the water were not disqualified. They didn't ruin the water because they do not disqualify your 40 because they're not too far from water. But the one way that these other substances could disqualify your mikvah, it's all going back to the thing we started today's halachas with, is by change of color. So if the mikvah changed so much that the color of the mikvah changed, now your mikvah is not a mikvah anymore because it looks different color than the natural state of those waters, and the mikveh is not kosher. That is the end of halacha 5. So there you go. You have the basics and the rules to understanding how the Rambam sees it. Now he's going to say there could be possible that there is a way that the waters could help. How could these disqualifying things help? Because remember, if you had a mikveh exactly 40 sa, you're very scared if someone goes to the mikveh and then takes out some water with them, all of a sudden your mikveh is not kosher anymore. So by adding, so you have now a kosher mikveh and you added one of these substance to it, as long as it's not discoloring it, and some water comes out when you leave the mikvah is still kosher because thank God you added an extra sub, these other liquids. Let's see halacha 6. There is a way for these above liquids that are not usually used to help the mikvah that they could help. Kate said, how is it? Mikvah sheish v'arbayim sub, there was exactly 40 sub in the mikvah. But now and then one of these items fell into the mikvah. Now it fell into a fully kosher mikvah, so whatever fell in becomes part of the liquids in the mikvah. And then he took a barrel, a jug or something, and pulled out one saw of water. The 40 left over are kosher. So once that liquid that doesn't help the mikvah become a kosher mikvah went into the mikvah that had already 40 saws, so it becomes part of all the liquids inside the mikvah. And then you took out one from there. Thank God you put that one in before because your mikvah still has 40 and it was nullified to the mikvah, and therefore the mikvah is kosher. I just lost my place. Let me go back to halacha Zayin. We're holding Zayin. Now we're going to give you more examples as the Rambam goes into ways that the water could be affected from other substances. If you washed, someone went to wash a basket used to collect olives, so it was maybe very dirty from olives, and he washed it and he went to the mikvah. He was looking for a place to collect it, and he washed the basket in the mikvah. Va'anovim, or grapes, and those could imagine how dirty those things are. V'shinu esmarav, and now by washing the basket in the mikvah water, the mikvah took on a new color because you washed your baskets of grapes and olives in there. It's still kosher. Why is it kosher? Because it's only considered dirt. If the mikvah becomes dirty, a dirty mikvah doesn't disqualify the mikvah. You didn't put wine in there and then the wine discolored it. It was not because you poured wine in there. It was used as a washing to wash stuff like a dishwasher. And now the mikvah became dirty. The mikvah is dirty now. Dirty mikvah doesn't disqualify the mikvah if it's dirty. However, if someone put a dye in, and I think the problem, if I understand correctly, the problem with dye, what is dye? Dye is water that was changed its color. So now it's too similar to the original mikvah water. Then it's considered handled water, even though it has a color, but it's water that it's not a new substance, it's a water. A dye is originally, the base of a dye is that it's water. Water is very similar to a mikvah. What's the problem with water that was handled? The problem is it's not natural anymore. So a dye will not change the mikvah because of a change of a color, because it's not considered a new substance, it's considered water, and therefore I guess the water, if you put a dye that was based off water, will not affect the mikvah with the change of color because it's water that you're throwing in there, not a totally new substance. It wasn't changed by wine. It wasn't changed by blood. It was changed by water that had a dye, that you put a dye to it. However, it will disqualify it like water could disqualify a mikvah. How does water disqualify a mikvah? Because water that was handled disqualifies a mikvah. That is the end of it. Very interesting how the Rambam looks at these different rules. If I understand it correctly, the basis of it makes sense, logical, why the Rambam is going through each thing of it. 4 more halachas left. Now, the question becomes, well, how do I fix the mikvah is there a way to remedy a mikvah that had discoloration by liquids that were foreign substances? The mikvah shenafa yayin, so into this mikvah by accident, the guy was drunk and he poured a bottle of wine into the mikvah, and the mikvah has the wrong color. Oy mayhal, oy sharmei peiros, or black fluids from olives or other kinds of fruit juice, vishina es marov, and the mikvahs got discolored. Vinifsal, and the mikvah is now not kosher because it looks like wine. Ketza takanose, how do you fix this? You wait till it continues to rain. It's not a problem. Enough of kosher water, rainwater, will fall into the mikvah, and the appearance will come back. It's an appearance issue. Fine. So once you have enough regular kosher water against the substance that's in there that's the wrong color, color will come back, and then the mikvah will be kosher. So there's an easy way to deal with discoloration just by letting the rainwater come in, more kosher mikvah water, rainwater come in, and it'll be a kosher mikvah. Now, it's even simpler. This is all if there was never the original 40 in your mikvah. That's why you need to make sure there's 40 saw of rainwater to come and fix it. But if if originally before your wine fell in there was a kosher mikvah, it had the 40 saw. The problem now is simply discoloration. It was a kosher mikvah, and I don't need to wait for rainwater to come. The mali v'shoyev, you could take your hose in, you could use drawn water until it returns, and now you got a kosher water. I guess I would assume that a filter would do the same thing. So you can't have the filter on when you're in the mikvah, but if a filter goes in and cleans the water, that probably would also be good. You just need the water to return to its site. Somehow the filter could make the mikvah go back to its color. The mikvah, so it's not complicated. Just if it looks like wine, you can't go to the mikvah in it. If it doesn't look like wine, it looks like water, you go to the mikvah. And you just remedy it by either adding more water, making the color go back. If wine fell into them, or how, again, this black fluid from olive like that, and it changed the discoloration a little bit. So what happens is part of it got changed. Let's say, you know how like it takes time for the discoloration to go to the whole mikvah. So you threw something in and it didn't make its way, or maybe it was like two mikvahs next to each other, or the discoloration didn't hit the old mikvah yet. It's maybe moving there, the water's not flowing, the color is kind of one area. Listen, if so much of the water got discolored, it's not just if there's a little corner, fine. There's 40 saw of a mikvah kosher here, no problem, going that mikvah. But if the color filled up so much that there's not even 40 saw, the basis needed for a mikvah that got discolored, you shouldn't use it as a mikvah. The same thing goes in if you go, if a certain small area of the mikvah is discolored and there is enough left which is not discolored to be a mikvah, and you go in the side that's discolored, then your mikvah is not kosher. He says so much so. Imagine there was a barrel of wine. Today, like the oil spills or so on. There was a barrel of wine in the big ocean. And that area where you went to the mikvah, that looks like wine. There's a whole ocean that's going to become dissolved in there eventually. But right now, you went to the mikvah and what looks like wine. One who goes to the mikvah in that area that looks like wine, the mikvah doesn't count. So even though it's attached to an enormous body of water that is of kosher mikvah water, if you go to the mikvah in something that looks like a different substance, like wine or so on, your mikvah is not kosher, and so on. Okay, let's continue. Halacha yud. There are three more halachas left. Now, here's the interesting story. There was 3 lugim of drawn water, and the 35 ounces enough to disqualify the making of a mikvah. Now, what happened interesting was here, the wine didn't fall into the mikvah. The wine fell into the disqualifying water before it fell. The disqualifying water, the handled water, fell into the mikvah. A drop, 2 ounces, 3 ounces of wine fell into a pitcher of drawn water. Now, what happened was those 3 ounces were very strong. The shina mare, and now the 3 ounces of wine, the 3 ounces of handled water, of drawn water, look like wine. Very interesting. That whole pitcher of drawn water looks like wine. It's so funny now. Originally, that drawn water would have disqualified your mikvah, but because the drawn water looks like wine, it looks like a new substance, not a water substance, a wine substance, but not for the mikvah. And then that drawn water fell into the mikvah. That drawn water won't disqualify it, elim shinas marav, unless it changes the whole mikvah there and changes the whole look of the mikvah. So very interesting. If it's a way for wine to fall into something and help you not disqualify your mikvah again. So drawn water usually disqualifies a mikvah before the mikvah has 40 sah. Here, the drawn water fell in, but before the drawn water fell into the mikvah, it changed to the color of wine, becoming wine. Wine is considered not water anymore. It's considered a new substance. And if wine, we know, falls into your mikvah, even before it has the 40 sah, it doesn't disqualify it because it's not considered water. Very interesting halacha. 2 more halachas left. Halacha Yud Aleph, as we wrap up this chapter. Shleish lugim chaser dinar mayim. There was 3 lugim of disqualifying water, handled water, but it was missing dinar mayim shuvim. Was missing 2-3 ounces of the necessary amount to disqualify the mikvah, the 35 ounces. And milk fell into that disqualifying pitcher. I made peiros or juice, but it still looks like water. But what made up the original 3 lugim, the original 35 ounces of disqualifying water wasn't just disqualifying water. It had a little bit of milk to create the 35 ounces of lugim necessary to disqualify it, it doesn't disqualify the mikvah, because the milk that fell into the disqualifying water cannot help it. It's a separate substance, cannot help it become enough, doesn't add to its substance enough to disqualify the mikvah that it will go into. Very interesting halach. And finally, mikvah shenishtan of what happens if the water changes its own color? Maybe if it sits and it soaks, the water starts to take on a darker color, so it changes color. And not because any other substance fell into it, just the water as it sits changes color. Hareza kosher, it's kosher. Even if it changed color, it's original water that changed color. The only problem with a thing taking on another appearance is when it comes from an external substance, not from the water. But if the water, it's not the problem that the mikveh itself changes. I guess it's not the problem itself that the mikveh itself changed colors. It could change another color, but it can't be a foreign substance that's not liquid that will change its appearance. Then it looks like that other foreign substance that it was. Only then will be disqualified and not be kosher. And that is the end, my friends, of today's